This is a demonstration of exercise 424, preparing a worksheet and closing entries. And this problem has given us a partial worksheet for Cynthia Elmer, CPA, as of December 31st, 2018, and the unadjusted trial balance, adjustments, and adjusted trial balance have already been completed. And in our requirements, we are just to complete the rest of the worksheet, which will be the income statement and the balance sheet columns. So in our previous chapter, we learned how to complete the first three sections of the worksheet, and now we're going to learn how to complete the end of the worksheet, which is actually the easier part. Once we have our adjusted trial balance completed, all we have to do is transfer the balances in the adjusted trial balance columns to the income statement and balance sheet columns and put them in the right debit or credit column. So for cash, we're going to start out with it in the debit column and do the same thing for all of our assets. You don't change any amounts or change any of the columns. You just transfer the amounts directly over to the balance sheet columns. And this just helps us when we get ready to complete our financial statements, because we've already pretty much got the information in the correct place, and we will already have calculated whether we have a net income or a net loss, and that just facilitates the whole process of completing the financial statements and ending up our accounting cycle. Now notice that we complete that all of our accounts go in the balance sheet column through the dividends account. So when you're completing your worksheet, just remember when you get to dividends, that's it. You're through with the balance sheet columns. Then you go to service revenue. You know service revenue is going to be our first income statement balance, because that's going to be the first thing that you would have on your income statement. So we put that in the credit column, and then all of our expenses will go in the debit column, because expenses have, remember, a normal debit balance. They reduce retained earnings. So after we get our last expense, now we're going to look at our totals for each of our columns in the income statement. We notice our debit column is less than our credit column. So that means we have a net income. I have the worksheet set up to calculate the amount of net income in a formula by subtracting total expenses from total revenue, and that gives us $15,350 of net income. So when I put that in the debit column, that makes both our debit and our credit columns equal, and we're through with the income statement portion. But remember that when you have a net income, where does net income go? It goes to retained earnings, and it increases retained earnings. So retained earnings has a normal credit balance. So we would put the $15,350 in the credit column of the balance sheet. And now we notice that our debit and our credit columns in the balance sheet columns also equal. So we are finished with our worksheet. We could complete our financial statements fairly easily. And the second part of this problem has asked us to prepare the closing entries. So after we would have completed our financial statements, the next portion would be to go ahead and complete the closing entry so we can get ready for the next accounting cycle. The first account we always close is our revenue account, and our revenue account is service revenue, which has a $100,000 credit balance. So if we want to close revenue, we're going to debit service revenue for that $100,000. So that's going to make the service revenue account now have a zero balance. Now the temporary account that we use to close our accounts is called income summary. So income summary would be credited for the same amount. And then our explanation would be to close revenues, or to close revenue, since we only had one. The next thing we do in our closing entries is close all of our expenses. Our expenses always have a debit balance, so in order to close those, we're going to credit all of our expenses and we're going to debit income summary for the total of all of our expenses. So we just start listing all of our expenses and their balances as they're shown, if you notice, in the worksheet. So we start with rent expense. Salaries expense is next. And I have my total updating as we go along. I have a formula in the problem to where it's calculating the total for income summary as we complete each portion of this. Close each one of the accounts. And our last expense is interest expense. Okay, and if you notice, we have the same total for income summary that we had in our income statement column in our worksheet. So that's another good check. And the explanation for this entry is just to close expenses. Okay, so once we have closed service revenue, closed all of our expenses, and transferred those balances to income summary, the next step is to close income summary. So we know that income summary is going to have a credit balance because income summary was credited for $100,000, debited for $84,650. So the difference between those is going to be that net income number. And that amount is $15,350, if you remember from our worksheet. And we credit retained earnings for that amount. So our explanation is just to close income summary. Income summary has to be closed to retained earnings, and we transfer the net income. Our last closing entry is to debit retained earnings for the amount of our dividends, and we also get that information from the worksheet, and we credit dividends because remember, dividends also has a normal debit balance since it reduces retained earnings, and our explanation for that entry is just to close dividends. So now we can see that we have completed our worksheet and we have closed all of our temporary accounts and transferred our net income to retained earnings, and we would be ready now to do the post-closing trial balance after we had completed our financial statements. So that is the conclusion of the demonstration for exercise 424.